In 1965, Ballantine Beer controlled 5% of the entire American beer market. That number does not sound extraordinary until you understand what it meant. 5% of every beer sold in the United States, in a nation of 200 million people, across 200,000 bars, taverns, restaurants, and grocery stores from Maine to California. Third place nationally, behind only Anheuser-Busch and Schlitz, ahead of every other brewery in the country. Their Newark plant was producing 9 million barrels a year. 9 million, at a single location. It was the largest single-site brewing output in the history of American beer. 7 years later, Ballantine Beer was bankrupt. Not acquired at a loss, not merged into a larger company, bankrupt. The company that had spent 125 years becoming one of the most recognized brand names in the northeastern United States filed for protection from its creditors in 1972 and never recovered. 4,000 workers in Newark collected their final paychecks. The three-ring sign, the logo that had hung above tavern doors from the Bronx to Trenton for longer than most of those workers had been alive, came down. No competitor had beaten them on taste. No health scare had frightened away their drinkers. No scandal had destroyed their reputation. They were the third largest brewery in America. And then they were gone. But the real story of Ballantine Beer is not the story of a bankruptcy filing. It is the story of what happens when a brand becomes so completely the identity of a place, a people, and a moment in time, that when that moment passes, the brand has nowhere left to go. Every week, we tell the stories behind the brands and the companies that shaped American life. Give the video a like and subscribe if you want to keep hearing them. The story begins in Newark, New Jersey, 1840. Peter Ballantine was born in 1791 in Airdrie, a mill town in Lanarkshire, Scotland. Airdrie in the late 18th century was not a place of comfort. It was a place of work, textile looms, coal pits, and the kind of labor that left marks on a man's hands before he turned 20. The families who lived there did not own things. They made things. That distinction would follow Peter Ballantine across an ocean and define everything he built in America. He learned brewing in Scotland, most likely in Glasgow or Edinburgh, where the tradition of ale production ran deeper than almost anywhere else in the English-speaking world. Scottish brewers of that era understood something that their English counterparts often overlooked, that ale was not simply a beverage. It was a staple. It was sustenance for men who worked with their bodies. The craft was taken seriously because the people who drank it depended on it. Ballantine arrived in the United States sometime in the 1820s, settling first in Albany, New York. Albany was not a random choice. It sat at the intersection of the Hudson River and the Erie Canal, which had opened in 1825, and was at that moment one of the most commercially active cities in the young republic. Goods moved through Albany. People moved through Albany. Ideas about how to build a business in the New World moved through Albany. Ballantine worked in the local brewing trade, watching how American distributors operated, learning the difference between brewing for a Scottish town and brewing for an American market that stretched in every direction without natural limit. By 1840, he was ready. He moved south to Newark, New Jersey, and leased a small brewing operation on Ferry Street, one of the oldest commercial corridors in the city. The rent records from that period have not survived intact, but tax filings from the city of Newark confirm commercial brewing activity at that address beginning in 1840. The initial capital investment is estimated at approximately $1,500, drawn in part from personal savings and in part from loans within the Scottish immigrant merchant community that had begun to establish itself in northern New Jersey. Newark in 1840 was a city in the middle of becoming something larger than it knew. The population sat at roughly 17,000 people and was growing fast, fed by waves of Irish and German immigrants arriving through the port of New York and fanning out into the industrial towns of New Jersey. These were working people, iron workers, leather workers, carpenters, and factory hands. And they brought with them a European habit that American commerce had not yet learned to serve consistently. They drank beer regularly as a part of daily life. The beer available to them was unreliable. Newark in 1840 had no dominant brewing brand. What existed were small neighborhood operations, often German-owned, rarely distributing beyond a few blocks, producing batches whose quality varied from week to week depending on the brewer's materials and the weather. A man could walk into a tavern on a Monday and find something cold and clean. He could walk into the same tavern on a Thursday and find something flat and sour. There was no consistency. There was no name he could trust. Peter Ballantine saw the gap with the clarity of a man who had spent 20 years studying how the craft was supposed to work. The opportunity was not to make a different beer. The opportunity was to make a reliable beer, the same flavor, the same quality, the same experience, and to deliver it farther and more consistently than anyone in the region had attempted. That was the entire strategy. It was not complicated. It simply required discipline, capital, and the willingness to build slowly. The first commercial batches came out of the Ferry Street operation in 1840. Records do not specify the exact volume of that initial production run, but by the early 1850s, Ballantine had expanded the Newark facility and was producing multiple product lines, evidence that the first decade had been profitable enough to reinvest. He was not yet a large company, but he had established something more durable than size. He had established a name that Newark could count on. Peter Ballantine made a decision in the 1840s that separated him from nearly every other brewer in the northeastern United States, and the consequences of that decision would echo for more than a century. He chose ale. In the decades following the Civil War, American brewing was moving in one direction: lager. Light, golden, cold-fermented lager, the style brought over by German immigrants, was becoming the dominant product of the American beer industry. Anheuser-Busch was building its national empire on lager. Schlitz was building its Milwaukee reputation on lager. Pabst was building its Blue Ribbon legacy on lager. The entire commercial logic of the industry pointed toward a lighter, more broadly accessible product that could be mass-produced, widely distributed, and consumed by drinkers who had no particular loyalty to any brewing tradition. Ballantine went the other direction. His flagship product, Ballantine XX Ale, was darker, fuller, and more complex than anything the lager brewers were producing. The 3 X's on the label were not decorative. They were a direct inheritance from the Old English and Scottish brewing tradition of marking cask strength, a signal to experienced drinkers that this was a serious product, not a thin commercial compromise. The ale was fermented at warmer temperatures than lager, which produced a broader range of flavors, a slight fruitiness in the finish, a more pronounced hop character in the middle, and a body that held up against food in a way that most lagers of the era could not. Then there was the second product, the one that almost no one today connects to Ballantine, but that brewing historians have spent decades reassessing: Ballantine India Pale Ale. India Pale Ale in 19th century America was not the phenomenon it would eventually become. It was a specialty product, rooted in the British export tradition of heavily hopped, high-alcohol ales brewed specifically to survive the long sea voyage to India without spoiling. Ballantine began producing its own version in Newark, and by the early 20th century, it had become one of the most consistently available IPAs in the United States. Some brewing historians argue, carefully, with appropriate qualifiers, that Ballantine IPA represents one of the earliest continuously produced American interpretations of the style. The craft beer revolution of the 1980s and 1990s, which made IPA the most popular style in American craft brewing, built on a tradition that Ballantine had been quietly maintaining in Newark for generations. Most of the brewers who ignited that revolution had never heard of Ballantine. The irony is precise and total. The third product in the Ballantine lineup was a lighter lager, produced specifically to capture drinkers who wanted something less demanding than the ale. Ballantine understood that a brewery with only one product had a ceiling. The lager gave them reach, the ale gave them identity, the IPA gave them something rarer, a product with no direct competition in their market. The packaging reinforced the brand at every point of contact. The 3 interlocking rings, Ballantine's logo, representing purity, strength, and flavor, appeared on every bottle, every label, every tavern sign, and eventually every neon advertisement the company produced. The rings were simple enough to be recognized across a crowded bar. They were distinctive enough to be unmistakable on a grocery shelf. In an era before television advertising, before digital marketing, before any of the tools that modern brand managers take for granted, the 3 rings did the work that 100 campaigns would do later. They made the name visible. They made it consistent. They made it trustworthy. Pricing positioned Ballantine precisely where Peter Ballantine had always intended, within reach of the working man, but not so cheap as to suggest inferior quality. In the mid-19th century, Ballantine XXX Ale sold in Newark taverns at prices competitive with the leading Philadelphia ales, occasionally undercutting them by a penny or 2 per glass. In an era when a Newark ironworker earned roughly $1.50 per day, the difference of a cent mattered. Ballantine understood that its drinkers were counting. The distribution strategy was where Ballantine built its most durable structural advantage, and though no one could see it at the time, planted the seed of its eventual vulnerability. Rather than selling through independent distributors, Ballantine invested in its own delivery infrastructure. Horse-drawn wagons in the early decades, then refrigerated trucks as the technology became available. The routes ran from Newark into Manhattan, into Brooklyn, into the industrial towns of northern and central New Jersey. By the 1880s, Ballantine had established direct relationships with hundreds of taverns along the eastern seaboard, not through middlemen, but through their own drivers, their own salesmen, their own cold chain. By 1900, no competitor could match Ballantine's freshness in the New York-New Jersey corridor. The beer arrived colder, faster, and more reliably than anything shipped from Milwaukee or St. Louis. In the tavern business, where a bartender's loyalty followed the supplier who made his life easier, that advantage was worth more than any advertising campaign. Ballantine did not yet dominate the national market, but within the geography it had chosen, the dense, industrial, immigrant-rich corridor between Newark and New York City, it was becoming something close to irreplaceable. The stage was set. What came next would transform a regional brewery into one of the most recognized brand names in the history of American beer. On December 5, 1933, the 21st Amendment to the United States Constitution was ratified, and Prohibition ended. For most American breweries, that date was a starting gun. For Ballantine, it was a homecoming. 13 years of Prohibition, from 1920 to 1933, had destroyed the American brewing industry with a thoroughness that no competitor or market force could have achieved. Thousands of breweries that had operated for generations simply ceased to exist. Their equipment was sold off, their facilities converted, their skilled workers dispersed into other trades. When the amendment was repealed, the physical infrastructure of American brewing had to be rebuilt almost from scratch. Almost, not entirely. Ballantine had survived Prohibition by pivoting to the production of malt syrup, a legal product sold ostensibly for home baking, though everyone understood its more common application. The Newark facility stayed operational. The equipment stayed maintained. The workforce, reduced but not eliminated, stayed connected to the company. When repeal came, Ballantine did not need to rebuild. It needed only to restart. Within months of repeal, Ballantine X-96 Ale was back on tap in Newark taverns. Within a year, the distribution routes that had gone quiet for 13 years were running again. The brand that had spent a century building loyalty in northern New Jersey and the New York boroughs re-emerged into a market where many of its former competitors simply no longer existed. The field had been cleared. Ballantine walked back in. The years that followed were the first act of a glory period that would last 3 decades. Production climbed steadily through the late 1930s. Then the Second World War arrived, and with it a set of conditions that would shape Ballantine's identity for a generation. The United States military needed beer. This is not a footnote. It was a deliberate policy decision by the War Department, which recognized that providing soldiers with familiar civilian comforts was essential to morale. American breweries were awarded military supply contracts, and Ballantine was among them. The company produced beer in cans specifically for overseas military distribution, flat-top steel cans, olive drab labeled, shipped to soldiers in Europe and the Pacific. On the Newark production floor, the workforce transformed. As men shipped out, women moved into the roles they left behind. The plant kept running, the contracts kept filling, and somewhere in the Pacific Theater, a young man from Bayonne or Hoboken or the iron-bound district of Newark cracked open a can of Ballantine and tasted something that felt, for a moment, exactly like home. When those men came back, from Guadalcanal, from Normandy, from the frozen hills of the Ardennes, they came back to New Jersey. They married. They moved into the new suburban developments spreading across Essex and Union and Middlesex counties. They bought refrigerators, and they stocked those refrigerators with the beer they had grown up drinking, the beer that had followed them across the ocean, the beer whose 3-ring logo they had known since childhood. The post-war suburban boom did not hurt Ballantine. It multiplied Ballantine. By the early 1950s, the Newark plant was operating at a scale that would have been unimaginable to Peter Ballantine a century earlier. The physical complex covered multiple city blocks. Employment exceeded 4,000 workers at peak production. The brewing operation ran continuously, around the clock, through every season. And then came the voice. Mel Allen was born Melvin Allen Israel in Birmingham, Alabama in 1913. He had a law degree from the University of Alabama and a voice that sounded like it had been designed specifically for radio. Warm, authoritative, unhurried, with a southern cadence that somehow made everything it described feel more significant than it actually was. In 1939, Allen became the primary play-by-play announcer for the New York Yankees. He would hold that position for the next 25 years. What followed was one of the most consequential brand partnerships in the history of American sports marketing, though no one called it that at the time. Ballantine Beer became the signature sponsor of Yankees radio broadcasts beginning in the late 1940s, and Allen became the living, breathing voice of the brand to an audience of millions. The arrangement worked because Allen was not performing an advertisement. He was doing what he always did, calling the game, describing the action, narrating the drama of a Yankee season, and Ballantine was simply present in that narration, woven into the fabric of the broadcast so completely that separating the beer from the baseball became nearly impossible for regular listeners. When Mickey Mantle connected on a fastball and sent it deep into the upper deck in right field, Allen's voice would rise with the crowd and then, after the roar settled, come back smooth and certain. A Ballantine blast. The phrase became shorthand. It became reflex. Fans who had never consciously decided to associate Ballantine with anything in particular found that the association had been built inside them. One broadcast at a time, over the course of an entire decade. The 1950s Yankees were not merely a baseball team. They were the dominant sporting institution in the most media-saturated city in the world. Between 1949 and 1964, the Yankees appeared in 15 World Series and won 10 of them. Every one of those seasons, Mel Allen's voice carried the story to listeners across the New York metropolitan area, and Ballantine's name rode alongside every pitch, every hit, every moment of championship drama. A 1955 radio spot captures the dynamic precisely. Allen, speaking between innings during a regular season game at Yankee Stadium, delivered the Ballantine advertisement in the same measured, confident tone he used to describe a double play. No theatrical urgency, no hard sell, just the quiet assurance of a man recommending something he considered worth recommending. The phones at Ballantine's Newark distribution center, by multiple accounts, ran busy the morning after significant Yankees victories. The connection between the broadcast and the purchase was not theoretical, it was measurable. For a 55-year-old viewer watching this documentary today, someone who grew up in Queens or the Bronx or Bergen County in the 1950s and early 1960s, the name Ballantine does not arrive as information. It arrives as a sound. Allen's voice, the crowd at the stadium, the particular quality of a summer evening coming through a transistor radio on the back porch. That is what Ballantine purchased with its Yankees sponsorship. Not awareness, memory. Beyond the Yankees, Ballantine extended its advertising reach through print campaigns, tavern signage, and eventually television spots as the medium grew through the 1950s. The three-ring logo anchored every execution. The brand's visual identity was consistent to a degree that many larger companies failed to achieve. Walk into any bar between the Bronx and Trenton and the Ballantine neon was there. The same rings, the same colors, the same signal that this establishment served the beer that this neighborhood drank. The advertising agency relationship during Ballantine's peak years produced campaigns that leaned directly into the working-class identity the brand had cultivated since Peter Ballantine's first delivery routes in the 1840s. Ballantine drinkers were not aspirational consumers. They were men who worked with their hands and wanted a beer that did not pretend to be something it was not. The advertising reflected that. No country clubs, no luxury settings. The imagery was taverns, ballparks, front stoops, and kitchen tables, the actual geography of the lives of the people who bought the product. By 1960, Ballantine had achieved something that very few regional brands in any consumer category have ever accomplished. Within its defined territory, the New York and New Jersey metropolitan area, it was not merely the leading beer, it was the default beer, the assumed beer. The beer that required no explanation when ordered because everyone in the room already knew what it was and where it came from. In 1960, approximately 3 out of every 20 beers sold in the greater New York, New Jersey market carried the Ballantine label. 1 in 7, in the most competitive beer market in the United States. By 1965, the Newark plant was producing 9 million barrels annually. Ballantine held 5% of the national American beer market and stood third in the country behind only Anheuser-Busch and Schlitz. More than 4,000 workers drew paychecks from the company. The three-ring logo was one of the most recognized commercial symbols in the northeastern United States. 125 years after Peter Ballantine leased a small operation on Ferry Street with $1,500 borrowed dollars, his company was among the largest brewing enterprises in the history of the Republic. The timing, in retrospect, was almost perfect, because everything that had built Ballantine into what it was in 1965, the geography, the loyalty, the single-site production model, the identity so tightly bound to one place and one generation, was about to become the precise set of conditions that would destroy it. The first warning arrived not in a boardroom but on a loading dock. Through the late 1950s and into the early 1960s, the major American grocery chains, A&P, Safeway, Grand Union, were systematically rationalizing their beer sections. The corner tavern had been the primary point of beer consumption for a century. It was giving way to something new. The supermarket, the refrigerated case, the six-pack carried home in a paper bag. Americans were drinking more beer at home and less beer at bars. And the companies that supplied those Americans were being evaluated by a new set of criteria. National chains wanted national suppliers. A purchasing manager at A&P's headquarters in New York did not want to negotiate separate contracts with 40 regional breweries across the eastern seaboard. He wanted one conversation with Anheuser-Busch and one conversation with Schlitz and one conversation with Miller. Companies that operated breweries in multiple states, that could guarantee consistent supply from a facility within 200 miles of any store in the country, that could deliver fresh beer to California and Texas and Florida with the same reliability they delivered to New Jersey. Ballantine could not make that promise. 9 million barrels a year from a single location in Newark was an extraordinary achievement. It was also a structural trap. The economics of shipping beer, heavy, perishable, expensive to transport, meant that Ballantine's cost per case increased significantly with every mile west of the Hudson River. By the time a case of Ballantine reached the Midwest, it cost more to deliver than a case of Budweiser brewed in St. Louis. By the time it reached California, the math was simply impossible. Anheuser-Busch had understood this problem in the 1950s and had responded by building a national network of regional breweries: Newark, Los Angeles, Tampa, Houston, Columbus. Each plant served its surrounding market with fresh product at competitive delivery costs. Schlitz had done the same. Miller was doing the same. The national brands were not simply outspending Ballantine on advertising. They were building a physical infrastructure that made them structurally impossible to compete with at the retail level. Ballantine's management saw the numbers. The internal data showing erosion in grocery channel market share was available by the early 1960s. The strategic response: build additional brewing facilities in other regions, establish the national distribution footprint that the modern retail environment required, would have cost tens of millions of dollars and required a decade of disciplined execution. It was the kind of investment that a family-owned company with strong regional cash flows could make, if it chose to make it early enough. Ballantine did not make it. The reasons are not entirely clear from the surviving record. What is clear is that by the mid-1960s, the window for that investment was closing. The national brands were consolidating their grocery channel positions with a speed that made catch-up increasingly expensive. And Ballantine, despite its impressive production numbers, was a company whose profitability was beginning to depend more and more heavily on a single market, the New York-New Jersey corridor, that it had always dominated but could no longer take for granted. The second warning arrived with a demographic shift that no brewery could have prevented, but that Ballantine was uniquely vulnerable to. The men who had grown up drinking Ballantine, the factory workers and dock workers and transit employees of the 1930s and 1940s, the veterans who had come home to New Jersey and stocked their refrigerators with the brand they had always known, were aging. Their sons were making different choices. The younger generation of New York and New Jersey drinkers in the 1960s was not inheriting brand loyalties the way previous generations had. They were open to Budweiser's national advertising. They were open to the lighter, more broadly marketed products that the national brands were pushing with budgets that dwarfed anything Ballantine could deploy. Ballantine's identity, working class, Newark-rooted, Mel Allen's voice on the Yankees broadcast, was extraordinarily powerful with one generation and almost entirely invisible to the next. By 1968, Ballantine's national market share had slipped from 5% to something approaching 3%. The Newark plant was still running. The three rings were still on every tavern sign in northern New Jersey. But the trajectory was unmistakable to anyone reading the sales reports. The family that had owned Ballantine for more than a century was facing a choice that no amount of loyalty to the brand could make easier. In 1969, the Ballantine family sold the company to Investors Funding Corporation. Those three words, Investors Funding Corporation, contain the entire explanation for what happened next. IFC was not a brewing company. It was not a consumer goods company. It was not a company with any operational experience in manufacturing, distribution, or brand management. It was a real estate and financial services firm based in New York, and it had acquired Ballantine not because it understood what Ballantine was, but because it believed the brand name carried enough residual value to be monetized before the underlying business deteriorated further. The acquisition price has not been definitively established in the public record. What is established is what IFC did immediately after the transaction closed. They cut the marketing budget. Not trimmed? Cut. The Yankees broadcasting sponsorship, the partnership that had made Mel Allen's voice and Ballantine's name inseparable in the minds of millions of New York area listeners for more than 2 decades, was terminated. Allen himself had already been let go by the Yankees organization in 1964, under circumstances that remain disputed, but the Ballantine sponsorship of Yankees broadcasts had continued under the new announcing team. IFC ended it. The single most powerful brand-building tool Ballantine had ever possessed, the association that had done more to embed the three rings into the cultural memory of an entire region than any other investment in the company's history, was gone. The advertising agency relationships were restructured. Campaign budgets were reduced to levels that made meaningful market presence in the New York media environment essentially impossible. A company that had built its identity over 125 years through consistent relationship-driven marketing was now operating in near silence in its own home market. The production cuts followed. To reduce operating costs, IFC began modifying the sourcing of ingredients and the specifics of the brewing process. The changes were not announced. They were not dramatic in the way that Schlitz's 1974 formula catastrophe would be dramatic. There was no single moment when Ballantine drinkers set down their glasses and refused to continue. The degradation was gradual, a slightly different character to the ale. A consistency in the XXX that felt marginally less reliable than it had been. Subtle enough that many drinkers could not have articulated what had changed. Clear enough that the bartenders and tavern owners who had been serving Ballantine for decades noticed immediately. Reports from Ballantine distributors in New Jersey and New York through 1970 and 1971 documented increasing rates of returned product and declining reorder volumes from accounts that had been reliable for years. Tavern owners who had kept Ballantine on tap as a matter of course began evaluating alternatives. Rheingold was available. Pabst was available. Schaefer was available. For the first time in the memory of many of these establishments, Ballantine was not the obvious choice. IFC attempted a relaunch. New packaging was introduced. A revised advertising campaign made a brief appearance. The price point was adjusted downward in some markets in an attempt to compete on cost with the national brands that were now dominating the grocery channel. None of it worked. A price cut cannot substitute for 20 years of relationship building. New packaging cannot replace the accumulated trust of a brand that drinkers had known since childhood. And a company being managed primarily to extract financial value rather than to build product quality cannot produce the kind of consistent, reliable experience that had made Ballantine worth trusting in the first place. The market share numbers through 1970 and 1971 tell the story without requiring elaboration. From 3% nationally at the time of the IFC acquisition, Ballantine's share fell below 2% within 18 months. In the New York-New Jersey corridor, the market it had dominated for a century, its position collapsed with a speed that would have been unimaginable 5 years earlier. By early 1972, IFC was unable to service the debt it had taken on to finance the acquisition. The operational losses at the Newark Brewery were accelerating. The distribution network that Peter Ballantine had spent decades building, the direct relationships with taverns and retailers, the cold chain routes that had once been the company's greatest competitive advantage, was disintegrating as accounts defected and delivery volumes dropped below the threshold required to keep the routes economically viable. The filing came in 1972. The Newark plant shut down. 4,000 workers collected their final checks. The delivery trucks stopped running. The tap handles came off the bars. The neon signs, the three rings, glowing amber and white above the tavern doors of northern New Jersey, went dark one by one. No ceremony marked the closing. No press release acknowledged what had been lost. A company that had operated continuously in Newark since 1840, through the Civil War, through 2 world wars, through Prohibition, through the Depression, ceased production without public acknowledgement of what its absence meant to the city that had built it and the people who had spent their lives working inside it. The sign came down on a Tuesday, 132 years after Peter Ballantine leased his first brewing space on Ferry Street with $1,500 borrowed dollars. The last batch had already been brewed. Nobody had thought to mark the occasion. The Ballantine name did not disappear with the bankruptcy filing. It was acquired, passed through a sequence of ownership transfers that tracked the brand's declining cultural relevance with uncomfortable precision. Falstaff Brewing Corporation picked up the trademark in 1972, the same year the Newark plant closed. Falstaff itself was already in the early stages of its own institutional decline, and its stewardship of Ballantine reflected that condition. Production of Ballantine 66 Ale and Ballantine IPA continued, but at contract facilities with no connection to Newark, no connection to the original brewing team, and no operational relationship to the process that had produced the product for more than a century. Pabst Brewing Company eventually acquired the Ballantine brands as part of a larger portfolio transaction. Today, Ballantine XA6 Ale and Ballantine India Pale Ale are still commercially available. Produced under contract, sold in a limited number of markets, carrying the three-ring logo on labels that look, at a distance, remarkably similar to what a Newark tavern would have stocked in 1955. They are not the same beer. This is not sentiment, it is a technical and geographical reality. The water profile of Newark, the specific yeast strains maintained in the Ballantine brewing operation over generations, the institutional knowledge carried by brewmasters who had spent entire careers inside that single facility on the Passaic River, none of that transferred with the trademark. What transferred was a name and a logo. The thing that made the name mean something did not survive the move. Among serious brewing historians, however, the Ballantine legacy has undergone a quiet and significant reassessment in the decades since the Newark closure. The specific object of that reassessment is Ballantine IPA. The craft beer revolution that began in the 1980s and accelerated through the 1990s and 2000s made India Pale Ale the defining style of American craft brewing. By the 2000s, IPA had become the best-selling craft beer category in the United States by a substantial margin. The brewers who built that revolution, the founders of Sierra Nevada, Anchor Brewing, and the hundreds of small regional craft breweries that followed, were drawing on a tradition of heavily hopped, assertively bitter ales that they understood to be a revival of something that had been lost. What many of them did not know, what the broader drinking public almost certainly does not know today, is that Ballantine had been producing a commercially available American IPA continuously from the 19th century until 1972. While the craft beer movement was framing itself as a rediscovery of forgotten brewing traditions, one of those traditions had been sitting on tap in Newark taverns within living memory. Ballantine IPA was not a historical curiosity. It was a direct predecessor. The beer that helped define the most popular craft style of the 21st century was being quietly discontinued in New Jersey at the precise moment the craft beer movement was beginning to form. The irony is nearly perfect, and almost no one has noticed it. Among collectors, the physical artifacts of the Ballantine era have found a market that the brand's corporate successors never anticipated. Ballantine cone-top cans, the steel containers with tapered lids produced in the 1930s and 1940s, designed to fit existing bottling lines before flat-top cans became standard, are among the more sought-after items in the American beer can collecting community. A Ballantine cone top in good condition sells for between $80 and $300, depending on the specific variant and its state of preservation. Original Ballantine neon bar signs, the three rings in working amber and white, sell for between $200 and $600 on the secondary market, and according to collectors who monitor the listings, rarely remain available for more than a few days before selling. The buyers are not exclusively elderly men from New Jersey, though that demographic is represented. They are also younger collectors drawn to the graphic design of mid-century American commercial art and craft beer enthusiasts who have traced the IPA lineage back to Newark and want a physical connection to that history. The Three Rings have acquired a second cultural life that their original owners did not live to see. The physical site of the Ballantine Brewery in Newark tells its own version of the story. The main brewing complex, which once covered multiple city blocks along the Passaic River, was demolished in phases through the 1980s and 1990s as the land was redeveloped. Some auxiliary structures from the original complex remained standing and were converted to warehouse and light commercial use. The neighborhood around the former brewery site has changed substantially. New residential construction, community development initiatives, the ongoing transformation of a post-industrial city attempting to redefine itself. There is no marker at the Ferry Street location where Peter Ballantine began. Nothing on the streetscape indicates that the third largest brewery in the United States once operated there for more than a century. Here is the detail that the historical record preserves almost as an afterthought, and that reframes the entire story in a single sentence. Ernest Hemingway was a Ballantine ale drinker. He referenced the brand by name in Islands in the Stream, the novel published posthumously in 1970, 2 years before the Newark brewery closed, in which a character orders Ballantine ale with the casual familiarity of someone who considers it simply the correct thing to drink. Hemingway did not write about beer brands as a commercial gesture. He wrote about them the way he wrote about everything, as specific, concrete details that located a character in a real world. That Ballantine ale appeared in his work placed it in a particular category, not just a regional beer, but a marker of a certain kind of American authenticity. The novel was published as the company was quietly dying. Neither fact acknowledges the other. What Ballantine Beer represents, across its 132 years of continuous operation, is something that American commercial history returns to again and again without ever fully resolving. A product can be genuinely excellent. A brand can be genuinely loved. A company can build real loyalty among real people over multiple generations. And none of that is sufficient protection against the structural forces that reorganize markets. The shift from tavern to supermarket, from regional distribution to national logistics, from inherited brand loyalty to mass media advertising reach. Ballantine did not fail because it made bad beer. It failed because the world in which good beer and a trusted name were enough to sustain a company had quietly ended, and the new world required a different kind of company entirely. The tragedy is not that Ballantine was bad at what it did. The tragedy is that it was very good at something that stopped mattering. Somewhere in New Jersey, there is a man in his 70s who still keeps a vintage Ballantine can on a shelf in his garage, not because it is worth anything particular, but because when he looks at the Three Rings, he hears something. A summer evening, a transistor radio, Mel Allen's voice rising above the crowd noise at Yankee Stadium, describing a ball going deep into the upper deck and then settling back into that warm Alabama cadence to say the name of the beer that his father drank, that his grandfather drank, that the whole neighborhood drank in a city that used to make it. If you want to keep hearing stories like this one, American brands, American companies, and the people who built them, give the video a like and subscribe to the channel. These are the stories that don't make the history books, but that shape the country we grew up in. See you in the next one.